Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Planet and the People, the podcast that explores the various different facets of climate change and what is being done to help protect our environment. So it is week 6 of the COVID-19 lockdown. Lockdown is starting to become the new normal somewhat. And I have once again decided to take my microphone out for a little bit of a stroll. So last episode, I spoke to Honor Eldridge at the Sustainable Food Trust, all about food and how it can be both a climate problem but also a climate solution. This episode is going to be delving into the world of science and technology, experiments that are being made and technologies that are being developed to try and help fight climate change. I have not one, but 2 shorter interviews for you. One which is about direct air capture technology, so machines that suck carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and then convert it into lots of useful things. And I'm also talking about the polar regions, the Arctic, the Antarctic, what they mean for the planet, how they are under threat, and what is being done to try and protect them. But first up, I spoke to Louisa Charles from Climeworks. This was actually one of my first ever interviews on this podcast. I did it long before lockdown started. Climeworks is a direct air capture company based in Switzerland. And without further ado, I may as well just pass you over to my past self and Louisa Charles. Thank you very much for talking to me, Louisa. So if I could sort of start by asking really talk me through what you do at Climeworks.
All right, sure. So what we do at Climeworks is essentially build machines that capture CO2 directly from the air. And we then, with that CO2, either sell it on for use in products, be they drinks or as a fertilizer in greenhouses or in renewable fuels, or we take the CO2 and we store it permanently underground. So we, for example, turn that CO2 we capture into stone.
So you've got a bit of a twofold project with the carbon capture. So you've got some plants at the moment in Iceland, which is largely to do with storage.
That's right. Yeah, in Iceland we currently have one pilot plant, which has been running since 2017.
Yeah.
And that's exactly that. We capture the CO2. We're working with our partners, the CarbFix team. And they take our CO2, mix it with water, pump it underground, where it then mineralizes and is then removed from the atmosphere.
So you've essentially got the commercial side of things, providing it to companies, as you said, carbonating drinks and the food and greenhouses, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But putting it down into the ground, how is that funded?
Sure. So the costs that we calculate in is the capture cost to Climeworks. So for every 1 ton of CO2 that we capture from the air, it costs us between $600 to $800. The storage cost is then just a fraction.
So the storage cost itself isn't much.
Isn't much, no, fraction.
And how much energy does it cost? How do you power these plants?
So we need an energy source, of course, and we build our plants in places where renewable or clean energy is available, or where we have energy from waste. The largest plant that we have to date is actually just outside of Zurich, and now we're sitting on the top of a waste incineration plant. And so through the burning of rubbish, energy is generated. We're able to harness that energy, which otherwise wouldn't be used.
Yeah.
We can use that energy then to power our machines. In Iceland, we're using geothermal. With plants where we're using solar. We could, in theory, also use hydro, wind. As long as the energy source is clean, then we're happy.
So onto the sort of the twofold project. So you've got the storage. You've also got your commercial side of things, and you mentioned greenhouses. You mentioned carbonating sort of food beverages. Talk me through that a little bit.
Sure. So all in all, there's 3 markets that we're active in. The first 2 are the ones where we recycle the CO2. So it's used in some kind of a product. So the first is food, beverage, and agriculture. So there are drinks companies, the likes of Coca Cola, HBC, Switzerland. They are
these clients that you've got, Coca Cola, they are
yeah, exactly.
your
They
product.
use Climeworks CO2 in their sparkling water brand called Valzid. And then we have the agricultural industry, so greenhouses who use CO2 as an airborne fertilizer for their crops. For photosynthesis, they require CO2, and then the higher the concentration of CO2 in the greenhouse, the better those crops can grow.
So yeah, I was going to ask how in with that with greenhouses and the food industry, how much difference does this make? How greater and more efficient is the yield of these vegetables with the carbon dioxide that's pumped into these greenhouses? Is it quite significant?
So the greenhouse that we're working with, called Gebrüder Meyer here in Switzerland, they have reported an increased yield of 20%. So it's
Okay, it's quite significant.
That's quite significant, yeah.
So that also, I suppose, helps the food industry. And with the beverage industry, where currently, actually, this might sound quite ignorant of me, but where currently does the carbon dioxide from carbonating canisters come from?
So depending really on the drinks company, but until now they have been using what they call conventional or industrial CO2.
Okay.
So it's CO2 that is produced as a byproduct from industry. And it's now that we're seeing they're wanting to make a shift away from this conventional CO2 that has a larger carbon footprint to using CO2 from a sustainable source, namely from air.
Yeah. And what's the difference in cost?
There is a difference in cost. But we have so far seen that the companies who've partnered with us so far, they are willing to pay a slightly higher cost for a more sustainable source of CO2.
And Coca-Cola is one of those examples. Coca-Cola in Switzerland, you said. So there was a third fold as well. You said some food, beverages, and what's the other one?
Yeah. So we've the first market, food, beverage, and agriculture, we call it. The second is then renewable fuels and materials.
Yes.
So that's essentially the synthesis of carbon neutral fuels, for which CO2 is a key raw material.
So for vehicles, for cars.
Exactly. Yes, that's something we do. Yeah. So we have a plant in Italy, for example, within the EU Store and Go project, and there we are turning with a network of partners, turning CO2 into fuel, which can then be used by trucks.
And is that fuel the same as petrol? So the vehicles that run off petrol or diesel, can they run off this, or do they have to be different vehicles?
In theory, they can run off it. The difference really between the carbon neutral fuel and the current fossil petrol, for example, is the amount of CO2 that is released through the combustion of the fuel. Right. So the fossil fuels that are in use all over the place, when we use those fuels, we're emitting extra, and when we use call it a renewable fuel, then because the CO2 has come from the air anyway.
Yeah.
When it's combusted, we emit that same amount.
So it's a cycle rather than. Yeah.
It's a cycle, exactly. We close the carbon cycle, if you like, and there's and we're not adding any additional CO2 to the air.
And so I suppose my question was for I suppose a petrol car and a diesel car are different. You can't put petrol in a diesel car, but do you have to have a special type of vehicle in order to use this fuel? Does the engine have to be reworked and redone?
Depends on the fuel. Depends on the fuel. I believe not all engines need to be reworked, but some would. It also depends on the mix of fuel, like jet fuel, for example.
Yes.
I think planes are currently able to run on a mix of fossil jet fuel and renewable jet fuel.
So when you say renewable fuel, this is your fuel. Jets can run off captured carbon.
They will be able to, yeah.
They will be able to.
We have a project with Rotterdam Airport, And we, in the next years, will be producing renewable jet fuel.
Oh, right. Okay. I suppose that leads me onto the question I was going to ask about where you are at with all of these things. You've mentioned Rotterdam Airport, you've mentioned Coca-Cola, and so you are essentially providing a product that could be bought by some massive companies. Like, could you be an alternative to drilling, for example? All the fuel companies that are looking for new drilling sites, could you provide an alternative resource for them?
That's not an avenue that we are pursuing. So there are a few direct air capture companies in the field. Some of them, yes, they provide their CO2 for that purpose. They're working with oil and gas companies. At this point in time, Climeworks, we have no involvement with any oil and gas company.
But the technology is such that it can provide an alternative. It can provide things that fossil fuels can provide in lots of ways.
Very much so, yeah. Yes, for renewable fuels, ideally in a decade or so, could completely replace our fossil fuels. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, so you think it's a decade?
Depending on how quick the scale up is. Of course, yeah.
Where do you think, since conception, since Climeworks, since it was conceived, how fast has the growth been?
So we have been around now for a decade.
Yes.
So we founded in 2009. When we began, it was really just our two founders at ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute for Technology, here in Zurich, and they started very small scale in laboratories, and they were capturing just milligrams of CO2 from the air. And 10 years later, we have more than a dozen plants in operation, 15 of them across Europe, and they're capturing several thousand tons of CO2 from the air. So the scale up we've achieved over the last decade is a nice one, factor billion. And the challenge now is to replicate a similar, if not the same scale up in the next decade to come. So move from capturing thousands of tons from the air to hundreds of thousands and one day millions of tons.
Yeah, that's exciting. I'll just backtrack a little bit and just ask, quite literally, how the technology works itself.
So the way the Climeworks technology works is quite simple. So we have a modular system. One of those modules we call a CO2 collector, which is a sort of a big box the size of a smart car. And on the one side of this box, we have a fan which draws air through the CO2 collector. Inside this box, we have a special filter material, which is highly selective, and it captures just CO2. We have sensors inside those boxes, which can measure exactly when the filter material is fully saturated.
Okay.
So a sponge would be if you dunk it in water. The same thing happens with our filter material. It just fills up with CO2.
And what's that filter material made out of?
We're working with a portfolio of different filter materials. But essentially, as soon as it's saturated, then we close the box, we heat it to 80 degrees Celsius, so relatively low temperatures, and through the application of heat, then the bond is broken between CO2 molecule and filter material, and we can then collect the CO2 and deliver it for whichever purpose.
Yes. And so just to check again, that filter material, is it, what sort of material is it? What kind of material is it? You said it's a portfolio of different materials.
Yes, more than that I can't say for IP reasons. That's the core of our technology.
Okay, but I suppose the question I'm asking, is it something that is a sustainable material? It's not sort of, because a lot of questions people have electric cars is what happens to the batteries, and so. Yeah, the actual core materials that you're using, are they things that are sustainable, renewable, that sort of thing?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. So I suppose next question. There's one of the things you say you promote is that you actually you provide these plants to companies. Is that the case?
Not quite. So
No.
what we provide,
Okay, I'm wrong there.
we provide to individuals is a service. So this is linked to what we're doing in Iceland.
Yes.
We're turning the CO2 into stone, and we offer both companies and private people the service of turning their CO2 emissions into stone.
Oh, okay. So people will essentially pay you their carbon footprint.
Exactly.
Yes.
They pay us to then remove CO2 in their name.
So how can someone do that? If I wanted to sort of come to you and say I would like to offset my carbon footprint through Climeworks, how do I do that?
So the best thing to do would be to go to climeworks.shop, and there you find different types of subscription where you can choose how much or what percentage of your carbon footprint you want to remove from air. Simple as that.
Okay. And I suppose that's the sort of thing that funds the projects, that's storage.
That's right.
Because one thing I saw about you create plants that are of any size. So you have the big ones, the massive plants, and then you have the smaller ones. Could you get to a point where, for instance, drinks companies will have their own plants at their factories that they will buy off you, and that will carbonate their drinks?
Yep.
Are you already at that stage, or is that something that you are aiming for?
That's something we're aiming towards. I mean, the beauty about direct air capture plants is we can build them anywhere. Really, we have another energy source, and ideally, a drinks company would, in the same location they have their bottling plant, also build a direct air capture plant, because then the transport costs are cut completely.
Yes.
And they're then capturing CO2 from air where it's then needed for drinks.
And in that eventuality, obviously, those plants are sort of with Coca Cola, for example, with a beverage company. They aren't necessarily powering their plant in the same way as you using thermal, using waste products. Would there be a certain element of responsibility if a beverage company got a plant? Would there be a requirement that they would power that plant through renewables?
They're very, very good questions. We're not at this point in time yet. Currently, all of the plants that we've built, we own and we operate.
Yes.
And we really just we sell that CO2 on. But in the eventuality that the company actually buys the full plant from us and operates it itself, then yes, I imagine we would have some kind of quite strict regulations as to how that should be run and using what kind of energy source.
Yeah. Okay. One question I was going to ask about the materials. You mentioned materials. You were talking about carbonating drinks, like food, greenhouses, fuel, but then there was materials. Talk me through materials.
So materials, we have the likes of plastic that can also be made using CO2. It's a market that we're open to. We don't yet have any concrete projects in, but essentially any kind of material that's currently created using CO2, regardless of the source of CO2, can be replaced using captured CO2.
Can carbon? So, I mean, carbon itself, can you use carbon for things like building materials, tarmac? I mean, you've got bicycles that are full carbon bikes. Is that something that can be a thing?
Definitely a thing, yes.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for Climeworks, not something we're currently focusing on, but
captured carbon could become a resource for actual products.
Products, yes, very much so. Yeah, I mean, we know of companies creating bracelets. Yeah, there is a whole host. Also, building materials using CO2, and there you're creating material, but you're also storing the CO2.
Yes, yeah. Another thing, back to talking about fuels. Is this is fuels? You're talking about fuels for vehicles, but can it be used as a gas for heating?
In theory, I would imagine so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose that leads me on to a question that some people have misgivings and queries about captured carbon and the technology, and I suppose the cost of it and the potential negatives that it could provide an excuse. Is there a danger that people might start to think, oh, I don't need to worry about my flights, I don't need to worry about my carbon footprint because there's this technology that's sucking it out of the atmosphere, so let's just carry on with life?
Yes and no. We used to see a larger danger in that until really there were quite a few global climate reports that came out, the likes of IPCC, and all of these reports really clearly stated that to make those climate targets, we need drastic emissions reduction.
Yes.
But that will not be enough, and we additionally need to remove CO2 directly from air, and that's the attitude that we've had since we were founded. We are not a silver bullet in any way. We are not an excuse to keep emitting, by no means, and that the world has to drastically reduce emissions, and then on top of that also remove CO2 from air. And that there are, of course, several different ways one can remove CO2 from air, and direct air capture is just one of those ways, and we see ourselves very much as part of the solution.
Just wanted to ask what is one average size plant that Climeworks has, what is the amount of CO2 it captures compared with a collection of trees?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So I'll start actually by saying that we love trees.
Yes.
We're very much for the world stopping cutting down trees as we're doing now, rather than planting more. We definitely need to be planting more trees. The comparison that you asked about, so the module that I explained, one CO2 collector, the size of a smart car, captures about 50 tons of CO2 from the air per year, and that's the equivalent to about 2,000 trees.
Okay, right. So it's very efficient.
Yes.
Yes.
And will become more and more efficient as we optimize it.
Of course. I think it's very exciting for you saying that you see the scale up in the last 10 years and the next 10 years. How far do you think we are from being at a really efficient, effective scale in fighting climate change and reversing it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, direct air capture is a relatively new technology. So we're far off. What we deem sort of scaled up enough, we call being climate relevant, and that is having technology that can capture millions, if not billions, of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're a few years off, but we're optimistic.
So that was Louisa Charles from Climeworks. Like she says, a relatively new technology, only really 10 years old, but already something that, to my mind, does offer some exciting opportunities. Maybe the obsolescence, if that is a word, the obsolescence of the burning of fossil fuels. Anyway, lots to think about, lots to dwell on with that. But I'm not going to give you much time to do that, because I'm going to now move on to the second topic of this episode, which is the polar regions. Now, the polar regions have been mentioned before, namely by Mark Maslin in the first episode of this podcast, namely the important role that the Arctic and the Antarctic play in the preservation of our planet. They are not just the home of the penguins and the polar bears, they are actually hugely significant for all of us, which is why I was so interested in speaking to Alex Sholtz, my next guest at Ice911 Research. Ice911 is an organisation that are looking at different ways of protecting the Arctic. So once again, I'm going to pass you over to my past self and Alex Sholtz from Ice911 Research. Well, thank you, Alex Sholtz, for talking to me. So you are here to talk about your work at Ice911 Research. And I suppose before I ask about Ice911 Research and what you do, just talk a little bit about the Arctic. And how is the Arctic, in your opinion, under threat from climate change at the moment?
Well, the Arctic and the polar regions in general are seeing the quickest and most devastating impacts of climate change. The poles have warmed much, much, much faster than closer to the equator. And most people don't really live up there, so most people don't see it or notice it as frequently. But since the 1970s, we've lost over 90% of the brightest, oldest, and most reflective sea ice in the Arctic. And that doesn't mean that we're not growing ice back every winter. We are, but the issue is that we're losing the multi-year ice, which tends to be much more reflective. So we're growing back what's known as seasonal ice, but almost all of that seasonal ice then retreats again in the summer, and we lose a little bit more of the multi-year ice.
So what does the Arctic mean for the planet in general?
Well, the Arctic plays a very important role in a lot of different ways for global climate. Just because it's thousands of miles away doesn't mean that it's not impacting your weather. So probably the most obvious way that it does that, certainly for people in the United States, and I think it must also impact Europe too, I would imagine. When the Arctic loses ice, you can get what's called a floppy or a wavy jet stream. So ordinarily the jet stream, which circulates around sort of in the upper latitudes, tends to be relatively tight and constricted and keeps cold air kind of contained towards the top of the Earth. But when you start to lose the ice and the Arctic starts to warm, that temperature gradient starts to break down, and so too does the jet stream. So the jet stream, as opposed to going very tightly around the top, starts to wobble up and down. And so what we see the impact of that in the United States is we get what are called these polar vortexes, where it'll get really, really, really cold. I went to school at University of Michigan, and every so often, maybe once or twice a year, you might get a polar vortex or a really intense cold snap. So what's happening basically is the air that was ordinarily in the Arctic, the very, very, very cold air, gets displaced because it's no longer contained by this, tight jet stream. So it comes down. And warmer air that's ordinarily over the continental United States or over the ocean moves up into the Arctic to replace it. And so, when the polar vortex is happening in the United States, it might be, 0 degrees in New York City or in Detroit, but it might be 32 degrees at the top of Alaska. Everything kind
Fahrenheit.
of Fahrenheit. Yeah,
that's quite scary. When you said 32 degrees at the top of Alaska in the winter, I was, what? So Fahrenheit, Fahrenheit. No. So also, what role does the Arctic play in keeping our planet cool and keeping our planet stable in general?
So historically, the Arctic has acted as sort of like a heat shield or a white T-shirt. The multi-year sea ice that's there tends to be old and cracked and full of inclusions and air pockets, and it looks very bright white. So that ice reflects a lot of the sunlight in the summer, and it's important to remember, too, that in the Arctic summer, the sun is shining 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
It's not like it sets and comes back up. I mean, it's constantly radiating the surface. And so having the ice there to reflect it is important and has helped to keep the Earth cool. By losing it, and what we've done, since the 1970s, is we've been losing it. So we've had less ice there to reflect the sunlight and more open ocean that's very dark to absorb it. And that in turn warms things up more. So we melt more ice, and then we lose even more ice to reflect it, and things get warmer and warmer. So it's called a feedback loop. That's what's known as the ice albedo feedback loop. So by losing ice in the Arctic, not only does that warm up the Earth by losing that reflectivity, but it also adds to what's called the forcing, because the warmer Arctic and the warmer Arctic in the summer will force more melting of ice in the future, and that will continue to warm things up, even irrespective of other climate change activities.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, actually, following on from that. We talk a lot about, in terms of climate change, about governments doing things to reduce emissions and to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and methane and all of those things. But meanwhile, the Arctic Ocean that is absorbing the sunlight, that is warming our planet as well. So that is something that essentially human beings will be thinking, well, that's almost too late. It's a result of emissions, but it's now already happening. So what can we do to reduce that impact?
Well, there's lots of people that are working on it. Ice911, which is the group that I'm a part of, is working on trying to restore Arctic sea ice. Our attempt is basically to intervene directly in that process that I just described, the ice albedo feedback effect. So what we think one could do, if it could be done safely and effectively, would be modify the albedo of the seasonal sea ice, that sea ice that grows back every winter, but tends to be less reflective. If you could modify the albedo of that sea ice, if you could use it as basically a substrate for something that was bright and reflective, like the multi-year sea ice that we've lost, then you could start reflecting more of that sunlight that's coming into the Arctic and intervene directly in the ice albedo feedback effect. And that should help to preserve more of this multi-year sea ice and perhaps even begin to regrow it in certain areas.
So how exactly are you doing this? So you are essentially helping the ice become more reflective, is that right?
Essentially, we're allowing that ice to mimic the more reflective multi-year sea ice. And by doing that, you didn't have to modify all of the ice in the Arctic. You could actually find some specific locations that happen to be particularly high leverage, is sort of the way that we think about it. And if you were to add increased reflectivity there, if you were to make that seasonal ice appear to be multi-year sea ice, so you decrease the amount of sunlight that's coming in and warming up the ocean there, then you could begin to restore some of the traditional circulation patterns in the Arctic, and you could begin to grow ice elsewhere. Now, the way that we're most excited about doing that, and what we've done a lot of our research on, has been using materials that are quite ubiquitous. They're called hollow glass microspheres, and they find themselves in a variety of products that people use, particularly construction products, but certain paints. Sometimes, I don't know, if you drive on the road, you might see the dashed lines in the middle or along the edge, and those paints tend to be pretty reflective. Oftentimes they're reflective in part because they have these hollow glass microspheres included in the paint. So they appear very bright white. They're sort of like snow that doesn't melt. And if you were to take them and put them out on the surface of this darker seasonal ice, then that darker seasonal ice will in turn look much more reflective. And the reason why we like these materials is because they're primarily silica, which is what sand is. It's something that is in large concentrations all over the earth. It's basically glass or sand. And any of the animals that have evolved in the benthos have evolved with silica all around them. Anything that's grown up on the beach has evolved with silica all around it. It's quite common, and in fact, it's a part of the ocean cycle itself. Every summer, 100 million tons of silica is blown off the Sahara, and iron oxide, other minerals too, but sand basically in dust is blown off the Sahara and into the Atlantic Ocean. So what we're talking about adding is just a fraction of that amount of silica, but to specific places in the Arctic where it might do a difference and it might be more reflective.
Okay, and do you put that on thin ice and water, or is it just on the ice? So obviously the ice sheets are shrinking to the point that where there's just water that's absorbing. Can you put that on water as well as ice?
You could. I think what we've found in our modeling and the way that we've sort of sketched out that might be most effective for doing this would be if you were able to get it mostly on the first year sea ice, because when it lands on the ice and the material gets there, it tends to sort of stay put. It'll kind of freeze into place, and it's what's called hydrophilic. So it likes water, it will stick to water, and if there's a thin layer of water on the surface of the ice, it will more or less stay there. If it lands on open ocean, it's more difficult to contain the material and keep it in one spot so that it's doing its job and reflecting things.
Okay, and how long does it preserve the ice for? As in, will that sheet of ice stay unmelted for the whole summer, or will it eventually melt before the winter comes along?
Well, that gets at another important question. So that ice that the material gets applied on, in all likelihood, most of it probably will still melt. But that doesn't actually mean that the material isn't growing ice somewhere else. Because what's important is when we lost all of this multi-year sea ice, this bright, reflective, older sea ice, we were losing reflectivity in certain regions of the Arctic. And so now when that first year sea ice melts away, it's gone and it's just open ocean. What we aim to do is restore that reflectivity and have it there for a little bit longer than it was before. So we are increasing the reflectivity in a certain area by using that first year sea ice as a substrate, and the material will protect the ice underneath it for a little bit, but it'll probably still eventually melt away. But by having that reflectivity there, even for an extra few weeks or a month, what we've done is you shift the radiative forcing in the Arctic in general. So you've intervened in that ice albedo feedback. You've potentially changed some of the circulation patterns in the Arctic. And even if you deploy some of this material off of Norway, you might end up growing ice somewhere off the coast of Russia or off the coast of Alaska.
So at scale, how do you get the silica onto the ice?
What we've looked at most closely as a way for actually deploying this material would be to use repurposed oil tankers, which have a huge internal capacity that could hold a large amount of this material. And then if you were to blow it at the right time of year when the winds were going in the right direction, you could actually move this ship along the edge of the ice and allow the wind to carry it out over a large area.
Oh, okay. So that helps you do it at quite a large scale then.
That's right. Yeah, I think sometimes people ask us, oh, well, how would you plan to deploy it? Are you going to use planes or what? And, really, There's no way to make it work with airplanes. There's just not enough volume. It would take too many flights. You certainly couldn't do it by hand. But allowing nature to carry this material out over the ice and disperse it, and using a large ship, which actually does have enough volume to carry a good amount of material, seems feasible. So that's what we've been pursuing.
And have you, at what stage are you at with this at the moment? Are you sort of at the experimenting level? Are you rolling it out on quite large areas?
We're certainly not rolling it out on quite large areas. We have to be honest and objective in terms of evaluating whether or not this can work. I think any sort of intervention in the climate naturally makes people uneasy. Nobody likes to think about going in and purposely pulling the levers to achieve an outcome, because there's always unintended consequences. So we start by saying, okay, we want to pick the absolute safest, minimal intervention that will still achieve the goals and outcome that we want. We're essentially trying to restore what's as close to possible as the original system that was there, and we're trying to do it with the safest possible material. So right now we're not testing at any big scale, but we are running very small field tests. We're doing ecotoxicology tests to look and see what the impact would be on the marine organisms and on the animals. We're doing life cycle assessment to see what happens to these beads. Do they impact the diatomaceous life cycle? Do they seed plankton growth, algae growth? We want to have answers to all of those major questions before we hand this work off to somebody who would have the capacity to begin to maybe purchase these ships and outfit them and get ready for a full-scale deployment.
On that, once you sort of reach a point where you feel like it can be rolled out, how's that funded? Is that funded as a sort of charity?
Yeah, currently we've been getting our funding from mostly private individuals and foundations who are interested in this type of work and want to see work done to try to save the Arctic. At scale, I don't know if that would be feasible, though it's certainly possible. We estimate that a full-scale deployment would be somewhere in the range of $5 to $10 billion, which sounds like a lot, but the United States is getting ready to pass a $2 trillion stimulus with $500 billion for companies in the wake of this COVID crisis, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of that going around the world. And you could fund it for 50 years at that level. So humanity can come together and can certainly afford this at a scale if we deem it to be an emergency. I think the reason why, another reason why you might not want to just do private donations for that, and you might want to look to public money, is because there is a little bit of a moral question on who has the right to modify the earth in this way. I don't think that it is necessarily a small nonprofit or just a group of people from California or the United States. In order to actually do this and do it with some sort of moral authority, it has to be a consortium of nations or people in the Arctic or the UN, something like that, who can say this is good and this is what we want and bring their own money to the table.
On that note, there's been a lot in the last 2 years, 3 years. Climate change has gained a lot more attention. We had an election here, and all the parties seem to be banding together, pledging a certain amount of trees, that we'll plant this amount of trees, we'll plant this amount of trees. Plastic gets a lot of attention. Do you think that the Arctic is being given enough press attention, the polar regions in general, and their importance and the work that you're doing?
I don't want to take away from any of the great press that other people have been getting. I think, planting trees is fantastic. I think reducing plastics is fantastic. But I think it's important not to forget the critical role that the Arctic plays in the ecosystem. And it's especially important for people to see the changes that are already happening there. I mean, the thing is with the Arctic, it really actually is significantly warmer now. The melt is coming sooner. There's less and less ice. And it's happening now. This isn't something that people are looking at from the mid-latitudes and like sea level and saying, okay, well, let's prepare for what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. This is something that's happening right now. And I do think that people could appreciate more that climate change is here and it is happening, and it's going to keep happening unless we do something to stop it, especially in the Arctic.
How far off do you think, and this might be a bit of a difficult question and might be one that you can't answer at this stage, but how far off do you think you are from being able to do this at scale or get someone else to do this at scale?
We've set a very aggressive timeline for ourselves. We want to be ready to hand this off and start partnering with people to be able to potentially do it at scale in 5 years. There's a huge amount of work we have to be able to do in between then and now. We still have to answer a lot of the ecotoxicology questions. We still have to have a good idea of what happens to these. We need to identify suppliers and begin to see what the production would look like. we need to see, actually start do a model deployment from a ship, not necessarily at a scale big enough to impact anything, but see, can we modify a ship like this? Could this actually work? So there's a lot of questions that still remain to be answered. There's a lot of work that we still have to do. We're growing our team as fast as we can. I think it's great that so many people are interested, but that's the timeline we've set for ourselves, and we think that it's very aggressive, but we think it's achievable.
And do you have, I mean, you don't have to name them necessarily, but do you have partners at the moment already who are kind of in place or shown interest in helping you roll this out?
We have a lot of academic partners at various institutions around the world, not just in the United States. And there are certainly people in governments that are interested in seeing this. But of course, it seems like in general governments don't do much, and then all of a sudden we have to do a lot and get it done. So we're not really expecting that to happen immediately or to have somebody pledge to do it when it's ready. And that may be premature too. I mean, we're still open to finding out that potentially this has a negative consequence or a negative side effect, and you wouldn't want to do it. So we're investigating it. We're trying to do it as honestly as possible, and we do believe that we have a lot of partners that will be able to help us get this to scale when it's ready and when it's time.
Okay. There's another. I read something about something else that you might be doing in terms of thickening the ice. So you've got the reflective sand, and there is also something that potentially pumping water during the winter from underneath the ice and on top. Is that right? Am I right in saying that, or have I made that out of thin air?
No, that's true. That's not our group, but there are lots of other people that are working on preserving the Arctic, and that's one of the other really good ideas out there. And it's important that we have lots of people investigating lots of different solutions, because not only do we not know at this juncture which one may turn out to be the most feasible or may work, but I think anybody who's looked at this space and looked at this climate change in general can recognize that it's a big enough problem that it's going to take a lot of different solutions to achieve it. We're not going to get there simply by planting trees. We're not going to get there simply by eliminating plastics. We're not going to get there simply by reducing air travel. We have to do all of these things together, and hopefully that will be enough.
So I suppose to wrap things up a little bit, what would you like to see governments all over the world, what would you like to see them do to help the Arctic and to help protect it and help your work and the work of other organizations?
I would like to see, I think, more openness from governments in terms of researching these types of ideas. For a long time, any kind of work that was deemed to be geoengineering, so going in and attempting to engineer the Earth or the climate, was basically off limits. For a lot of people, it was just too touchy of a subject. But I think more and more people are realizing that we're not going to be able to achieve some of our goals at arresting climate change in time unless we begin to look at some of these solutions, begin to investigate them, and begin to ask the questions. Because at the end of the day, if things get really bad and we sort of feel like we're backed into a corner and have to do something like this, isn't it better to have asked these questions 5 years or 10 years in advance and have the answers to them about what might happen than not? So I'd like to see more openness from governments in terms of just investigating these things. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to do them. That's a question that we'll have to cross when we've fully collected the data and we understand what these trade-offs might be as best as we possibly can. But that would be the single biggest thing I would ask for.
And also another question that I didn't ask you before was backtracking. I'm bouncing along, but
Sure.
Where do you get the silica from, the materials that you use?
So it is a commercially available product, and quite a few people make it. We've just been buying it from a number of suppliers, basically, in the United States and abroad. We're working on developing essentially a specification for what we find to be the optimal material characteristics, so that we can begin to shop that around at multiple suppliers and get a material that's produced specifically for Ice911. But right now we've been shopping for glass microspheres that meet our criteria at various suppliers.
Okay, I've got to ask also, what is the impact? Is there any negative impact on wildlife?
Well, it's not acutely toxic, as far as we know. We've looked at it in fish, we've looked at it in birds, even at concentrations that far exceed what anything might encounter in the wild. So there isn't anything that we know for sure about it that says that it's toxic. I mean, we haven't found any negative impacts. I'm very hesitant to say that there aren't any, simply because there's so many questions that we don't know yet. You know, we don't know if it might impact other aspects of their ecology or something else. But for now, we're cautiously optimistic that things look very good and very compatible with animals in the environment.
Okay. And I suppose lastly, what can the public do to help your work?
Well, we are currently trying to grow the team and certainly add expertise, particularly in the areas of ecotoxicology, but also in regulatory areas. We've always tried to work and be fully above board and always be permitted. So sometimes that makes our job a little bit more difficult than it maybe could be, but we're, in the process of applying for some permits through the EPA and in other nations. And so people that have experience in that area, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from people with experience in ecotoxicology testing in this particular thing. And, if you just want to support us by sending us $5 or $10 or something bigger, that would be fantastic too. It's not cheap, going up to the Arctic and doing these tests and trying to get the instrumentation to get the really high quality data we need out of it. So that would be fantastic. We've got a wonderful team of volunteers and people that are working on this full time. And so, any way that you wanted to contribute or support to that would be useful for us.
Do you have regular subscriptions where people pay monthly donations?
We do. We've got a terrific core group of subscribers and people that are, make monthly donations at various levels. And then we've got commitments from bigger people and foundations as well. So, but everything counts. I can tell you personally, every donation means the same to me, and it's all really fantastic.
And you can do that at your website, ice911research.org.
Yes, you can. ice911research.org/donate.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex, for talking to me. And actually, I will finish off with one last thing to ask. How do you feel about the situation in terms of hope? How hopeful are you that we as a human race will be able to solve this?
I think it's always good to have hope. I certainly haven't given up yet. I think that there's a lot of really, really smart, competent, and capable people working on this problem in different places all over the world. And I do think that this is something that humanity can rise to the challenge and we can beat, and we'll find a solution. And if not, I suppose one will be found for us.
So that was Alex Sholtz from Ice911 Research. I've just come under some shelter because it has just started to rain, which is fantastic. So, 2 different interviews, offering 2 very different perspectives, very different organisations. So if you'd like to hear more about Climeworks, they are online, climeworks.com, and they are also on social media at Climeworks on Instagram and Twitter. Same goes for Ice911 Research at Ice911 Research, and their website is ice911.org. So that brings us to the end of episode 3 of Planet and the People. Thank you very much for listening. If you do want to find out more about the podcast, post questions, ask anything, do follow me at Tom Ward Thomas on Instagram and Twitter. Next week we're going to be returning to the natural world, and we're going to be talking all about trees. I had a chat with someone from one of my all-time favourite organisations when it comes to reforestation, and that is Ecosia, the tree planting search engine. But until then, I'm going to say goodbye, brave the rain, and have a good week.